Welcome, everybody, to the fourth after party of the Trustee Handbook Book Club. I'm Ron Kursop. Today, with Brian Hildreth, we will moderate this session, which is dedicated to answering all the unanswered questions and the ones that need a little more explanation from previous book club sessions. If this is your first time watching the Trustee Handbook Book Club, we provide insights into library governance for trustees across New York State by answering questions from trustees just like you. If you're a fan of the Trustee Handbook Book Club, please be sure to register for our advocacy session on July 22nd, 2025 at 5 p.m. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our co-promotional sponsors. A big thank you to the New York State Library, the Public Library Systems Directors Organization, the Library Trustee Association, and the Public Library section of NYLA. Without you, we wouldn't be able to keep this program going. Before we get started, I'd like to give a warm welcome back to Jerry Nichols, who's joining us after a bit of a hiatus, I think since January during our last after party session. Jerry, it's
Yeah, I'm
great to
good.
have you.
Yeah. Ron, I'm like that crazy uncle you have to invite for Thanksgiving that
That's
you don't know what
that's
else to
right.
do with, but every once in a while he's got to show up for the cranberry sauce. So
Well, it's great to have you
thank you
back. We're looking
for the
forward to
invite.
everything that you have for us today. Rebecca Smith Aldrich is also back. She's the co-author of the Trustee Handbook and our resident expert in library governance. Fun fact, this is Rebecca's 23rd Trustee Handbook Book Club session. She's been part of all of them. So thanks, Rebecca. When we started this in 2021, I don't think any of us thought we'd be recording these today, but I'm glad we are. So this is great. So, with both Jerry and Rebecca's combined wealth of knowledge and experience, I guarantee this after party session will be both informative and helpful. Lastly, a huge thank you to all of you watching. We hope you get a few things out of this and you enjoy. So, now let's go ahead and get started and dive into these questions. Brian, what's our first question?
All right, so the first question to get us started for the day is, under what circumstances can a trustee be removed from office? I'll let Rebecca or Jairus get us started.
Okay, well I'll take the lead on that one since that's one of the tougher questions that you're going to have today, I'm sure. Before I start, I do want to do a quick shout out to an old colleague of mine, Joe Eisner, who he's rather elderly now, but he's still with us, and he put together during his times as a library director um, a uh, a wealth of knowledge for regarding legal opinions and court cases and whatnot for library stuff. So I quickly looked at Joe's library that he put together that's available through the Nassau Library System to grab some of the legal background for this. Now, all of us have had some experience with it, but let's start from the very beginning. And in this case, for all libraries, the first place to look is Education Law 226. And I'm going to read from it, both from Subdivision 4 and Subdivision 8. I'm going to give you the chapter and verse real quickly. Trustees can be removed, unquote, for their refusal to act, a failure to attend 3 consecutive meetings, which we'll go back to in a minute, without excuse accepted as satisfactory by the trustees, which is another issue, or any other cause specified in the charter of the library. The regents, separate body now, the regents may also remove a trustee for misconduct, incapacity, neglect of duty, or where it appears to the satisfaction of the regents that the corporation has failed or refuses to carry into effect its educational purposes. That's a point we're going to revisit in just a second as well. Furthermore, 226 subdivision 8 says that the trustees of every corporation may remove or suspend from office by a vote of the majority of the entire board, any trustee, officer, or employee, etc., upon examination and due proof of the truth of a written complaint by any trustee of misconduct, incapacity, or neglect of duty, provided that at least 1 week's previous notice shall have been given to the accused and to each trustee. Now, furthermore, there are other laws that govern this, because that would be most of the law for an association library. If you're a school district library, however, and an elected trustee, You must refer to school law because you're covered by basically the same regulations, procedures, and laws and decisions that school board members are, which is far more extensive and in most cases will require some legal assistance. If you're a public library in a municipality and or a special district library, neither one of you are covered by the Commissioner of Education in that case. And you will refer to the public officers law. And of course, if you're a municipal library, the removal probably can't be done by the Board of Trustees. Is going to the appointing officers are probably your town or village or county in that case. That notwithstanding, it's safe to say that this is much easier said than done. And I'd like to touch base on a couple of common issues that are brought, at least to my attention, and I'm sure to my colleagues who are much more active these days, regarding getting rid of trustees. First of all, get something quickly out of the way. If they commit a felony, they can go. Or it's not just a felony or a crime in violation of the oath. So what that means is most misdemeanors are not grounds to get rid of a trustee, but some may be. So, for example, if it's a misdemeanor, it has to do with a conflict of interest with the library. Yes. So you're going to have to be very, very thorough. The other point that all of the legal opinions make, and those of the commissioner and in the courts, is that you must document this. This can't be that you had an argument at a board meeting and he said, she said, and whatnot. It needs to be documented. So let's jump to one that comes up, unfortunately, too often these days: abusive behavior, a board member acting out. Well, those of you who are familiar with libel law know that these days public officials really have to take a lot of abuse. And so when it comes to what abusive behavior means, it means that you'd be well advised to have a board policy regarding the conduct of your meetings. But you also need to have witnesses and exact details of what the abusive behavior was. For example, one of the for a school district board member to be removed, they literally had quotes from a meeting of the person being very abusive to members of the audience and other board members. It was documented. The commissioner said, and literally, it's language that you really don't want to see in any way, shape, or form, but they have to put it in the legal context. So you need to document this type of active action. The other thing that comes up quite a bit is talking about executive sessions. And there's quite a bit of legal information about board members from all organizations sharing information from executive sessions to people that are not part of the board. And a lot of board members think, oh, that's a reason we can get rid of another board member because they blabbed about what we said. Well, not quite. The opinions are clear as mud, but the one thing they do agree on is that the sharing of the information must have caused harm to the organization. So if you're negotiating a real estate deal and the person is dealing with a real estate person and it affects the price, that's harm. But if it's just that, oh, do you know what they said about such and such? Is it harm? Good question. But you need to prove it. Again, this gets very legalistic, folks, especially in elected boards. It might be nice in an association board to write it up what the offense was and present it to the person, give them the week's notice and whatnot. But they can still appeal to the commissioner. Now let's move to the other issue that actually has happened recently in the state of New York, and that's the regents removing trustees or the entire board. In the judgment of the regents, if the board is not doing the job of providing a good quality library service, and that's defined by meeting minimum standards, folks. If they're not doing that, the board of regents has the right to remove them, and they have done that in the recent passed. They've removed an entire board. But they put it together, and obviously this material was put together for the Regents review in a very, very comprehensive document with all kinds of with documentation, with literally the content of a webinar I gave to this particular board, for example, and obviously a lot of board minutes and whatnot, and a failure to comply with minimum standards. So that can be done. And that's up to the Regents, but that takes a very, very long time. So one last comment I did want to say. I've asked about boards, censoring another trustee. There's no such thing. The word censure does not exist in the legal sense insofar as the powers and duties of trustees, nor of the Commissioner of Education. So you can call them out, of course, but you can't pass a censure. It means nothing. It's your best, I think, advice here is that a good board president is going to maintain a well-ordered board meeting. You should have a policy for appropriate conduct of the public as well as the board. In other words, no, personal attacks, use of, appropriate language, whatever you can put together. There's great examples out there. But the fact of the matter is, if a trustee whatever misconduct is, you need to really define it closely and prove it. So that's, I think, the preface. Other than that, we can go into this forever, but I will suggest that if you're serious about it, seek legal counsel.
I also see it as almost like a progressive discipline type of approach. So you're taking off from where Jerry just left us off, thinking about setting expectations. Have we been clear about the job description of a trustee, our ethics statement? We've all taken the oath of office. In an association library, you might want to create a modified version of that. We've got our conflicts of interest. We've done an orientation to really make sure folks understand the process, procedures, how we do things in this board. We've explained or provided training on open meetings and executive session. Like, let's give everyone a fighting chance to be the person we need them to be on the board. But when someone is acting out, is getting in the way of process, is really becoming an obstructionist to the board conducting the work of the board, we have a chat, right? Our board president's going to go chat with that person, help them understand, what might be disruptive to the group, see if they need some help, some training. So just like you would in a workplace situation with a manager and employee that's trying to manage behavior that's not conducive to the group, we want to give that person a chance, right? And then we'll move it forward. If they don't get it, they're like, I don't care, I'm going to do this anyway. Then we start documenting things and building a case in that direction. So Jerry, you gave us a good kind of legal definition of the kind of challenges for each type of library to pursue the removal of a trustee. But even though it might be difficult or challenging or a little scary to do, for the good of the whole, it may be necessary to double down and go through that. I've been involved with a couple of cases where we have had to follow through with this. And a couple things I just want to put on people's radar if you are going to move forward is that due process aspect that Jerry noted, making sure that the complaints are in writing from another or multiple trustees on that board, that the person in question has been presented basically with those charges that the other trustees have against them, and they've been mailed to them by certified mail or handed to them in person at least 10 days ahead of the meeting at which you're going to address this and potentially vote on that. I had one library that wasn't aware of that 10-day window, and they just sent it with the agenda like they do in a normal board meeting, and that null and voided the vote, which was unanimous to remove that trustee, and they had to redo it, which didn't look so good from the public specter of that action they took. And that's where we have to really center this conversation, is trying to avoid having this done in the full view of the public and seeing that dysfunction. But if that person's causing the dysfunction, we also have a responsibility to address it and fix it and move on for the good of the institution.
Rebecca, I think this is also a good opportunity to touch on something we mentioned, I believe, in the trustee handbook as well. A trustee can be removed if they miss 3 consecutive meetings without an acceptable excuse of the board. Well, the sad part of that is most boards accept anything as an excuse. Oh, I got to go to Florida for 5 months is a good excuse. Please don't do that. I believe that boards should have the responsibility to police themselves and can adopt a policy that does not allow excuses, frankly. There's a way to do that. But the fact of the matter is that all too often we take the easy way out, and we need board members to attend board meetings. And no, zooming in now from Florida doesn't count.
It may count depending on the policy of the library now that the law has
Well,
changed, but
that,
it's challenging. It's challenging for the group to have those hybrid meeting environments.
yeah. So please keep that in mind. It's your job. If you can't meet the requirement to get to meetings, then find another thing to volunteer for. That's simple.
So
You're
Ron and
right.
Brian, you're system directors. Have you been involved in this situation? Any tips you wanted to share or things you want to emphasize?
I haven't been involved with this directly. It's come up a few times where there's been a situation or an issue, but it hasn't been serious enough for removal. And usually in these instances, it's a lot of conversations and just restating what you had said, Rebecca, about like kind of redoing an orientation, talking conflict of interest, reviewing oath of office. Because if somebody's in the third year of their term, maybe they've become a little rusty on some of that stuff. So it can be good to just make sure that that information is given front and center and then reviewed on a regular basis, just so people don't forget what their responsibilities actually are as a trustee to the library.
Yeah, and I was just grateful we have Jerry here to answer this question because the answer was so comprehensive and technical, far beyond anything that I could provide. But just in our experiences, and I was going to ask a follow-up question about this, is just like the situations that we deal with are sometimes just, it's not so much that like the trustee or a trustee is overtly like um, committing things that go against the grain of like duty of care, duty of obedience, or even just like the authority of the board policy. But I do think it goes back to those foundational things is like, if you have a trustee, and this is what we experience within our system on very rare occasions, is you have that individual that may show up for 2 meetings and then they miss the next one. And they have an excused absence, but they missed it. And then they come back for 2 meetings and then they miss again. And so, out of 10 to 12 meetings per year, really, when you add it up, they're in attendance for half the time. And so it goes back to what Ron was talking about is just the board president's responsibility of having conversations with trustees, the director and the board, or the director and the board president working together, making sure trustees are participating in trustee education. That's why the legislation is there, is to remind us of the things that need to be sharp on our tool belt, so that like when we do stray a little bit, or we have an individual within the collective that strays a little bit, we go through that training to remind ourselves of what the responsibilities are. So. Really good answer, Jerry and Rebecca. Thank you.
I think you're right, Jerry. This seems like it could be a whole trustee handbook book club on its own. There's so much information that goes into it.
Hey, let's throw one more advertisement in for what we have in the handbook. You've got to have a good trustee orientation. Remember,
Mhm.
the primary reason people fail in their job is that they don't know what it is. So follow what my colleagues here have said. Training is absolutely, well, now it's legal. You've got to do it, but not just an hour here, an hour there. You need a very thorough orientation so people understand their job and have policies in place.
And there's a whole chapter on that with basically a rubric in the handbook. So if you're listening to this and you need some guidance on how to do that, take a look at the trustee handbook, orientation, new trustees. It's all in there what you should be talking about. All right, let's move on to our next question that we have. This one's also covered quite a bit in the new version of the trustee handbook. What are some best practices for the operation of board committees? And in the handbook, I think there are 6 committees that are listed: the finance, personnel, buildings and grounds, policy, strategic planning, and then some may even have executive committees, which falls under a different portion of law, and then different ad hoc committees. But when you think about these types of committees at a library, what are some of the best practices for how they operate and interact with the board as a whole?
Yes, we want to give a shout out. This question likely came up during our session on governance and committees. So I'm happy to rehash some of this because I think it's really important. And sometimes committees are underused in our library boards, and they can really help speed up your meetings, have more well thought out conversations for folks that can take the time to really dive into something. But it all starts, it's almost like a little repeat of what we were just talking about for trustees to understand the job. Committee members need to understand the job. Do we have a strong purpose statement for why we have this committee and what there are expectations missions or objectives are of that committee. That should actually be written out. So when a committee chair takes over, they understand this is my charge. This is what I'm doing here this year. I'll also share that making sure they're aligned with the priorities of the board for the year is really important. Here at the Mid-Hudson Library System, our board votes on our priorities for the year in January. Our committee chairs meet 3 times a year to make sure they're focused on those priorities as well. And then we have annual activities that are mapped to those committees. So they understand, oh yeah, we've got to do this at this time of year. So they really have an agenda. They know what they're supposed to be working on, as well as having things referred to them by the full board. That creates the structure necessary, I think, for success. And then at those meetings, at the actual committee meetings, we want to see our director there. So they're part of those conversations as your technical advisor, and probably saving you an awful lot of time when you dive into some of these topics. And sometimes the board president is serving as ex officio on all of these committees as well, not to judge and necessarily participate or take over, but so they have a holistic view of where committees are coming from on some of the topics that they're dealing with. And then I know it's extra time, but I do think it's important to do written reports out of committees. Something that trustees that aren't on the committee can review the discussion and the recommended actions before a board meeting. So when those committee chairs are giving that report, folks are not, just hearing it all for the first time and trying to digest what the committee chair is saying. So I think those are some of the key elements to success for committees. And then, if there's nothing to talk about, don't meet. Like, you're not required to meet when there's nothing going on. So let's give everyone a break and not drag them through meetings that are pointless.
Rebecca, I'd like to take the other side of the coin real quickly,
Okay.
and then I'll shut up. Yeah, they can be underutilized, but they can also be overutilized.
Yes.
Quite often, actually more often than not, I've been called into libraries where there are too many committees, and they were created in order to micromanage the organization. And having 7 committees meeting every month, and then having long board reports. It's like, why bother having a director, which is why they were created in the first place in many cases. So I just want to just caution that is prevalent in many libraries. So
So
if
you
you
use the
need
word
them,
micromanage. I use the word evolution, because in my world, what I see happening is the overuse of committees is a holdover from when libraries didn't have the capacity of staff to run the organization the way it probably should
all
have.
right.
And then the board didn't take responsibility to right size the committee structure once they had adequate staff. And that's where the micromanaging comes in, right? And helping the board understand that just because it's in the bylaws now doesn't mean it always has to be there. If the structure's not working and it's getting in the way of the management role of the director, let's change and make it better.
This is why you need that cynical old uncle at the Thanksgiving dinner.
Please pass the cranberry sauce.
Yeah.
When libraries ask me about committee structure, like what should they be doing, I always say research and recommend action. Like those are the things that I think committee structures are the best for. It's easy and they get it. And when I say you don't want to take your full board meeting to analyze an issue, give it to a committee so they can do the work, bring it back. You have your board report, as Rebecca said, from your committee. Everybody's on the same page. They can ask questions, and then you can figure out what's the most informed way to move forward with this.
I think that's a super important part for us to emphasize. You're not decision makers. You're making recommendations.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think just keeping yourself organized for the upcoming year. I think sometimes where I see committees run into challenges is when there's a change in the chair. And so like a new chair, you have a highly engaged chair that's maybe been doing it for a few years. They know the flow of the year. They know what needs to be expected at the beginning of the fiscal year after the annual organizational meeting. But then you have a new chair comes in. 2 things that I would highlight are really important is the incoming chair works with the outgoing chair to make sure that like they're well versed in like what that cycle looks like throughout the year, what's expected of the chair in terms of not only working with the trustees, but also working with the director. What's the type of information that the director needs to be sharing with that chair so that the chair can be effective in their job. And then the other thing that I think really is helpful with committees, and Rebecca touched upon some of this, is like making sure that within the bylaws, which will reference what committees are either ad hoc or standing, but having a very specific definition of what that standing committee is, what its charge is, making sure that charge aligns with your strategic plan or your plan of service. And then also at the beginning of the year, whether it's an incoming chair or an outgoing chair, make sure that chair is working with the director as well as the trustees that are on that committee, put some objectives together that align with that plan of service. So making sure like, okay, let's take a look at our plan of service. What are the goals that we've set for ourselves for this year? So what are the very specific things that this committee needs to do to make sure that when 12 months have passed, we've moved the needle in terms of meeting some of those goals as it aligns with the overall plan of service. Yeah. I think that takes us into our next question. It kind of touches upon opens meetings law. Jerry mentioned it a little bit, and Rebecca went back and forth with Jerry on it, but do video participants count as part of a quorum? So we got to go back to open meetings law and the recent changes to open meetings law. What type of policies need to be in place, and how do we set that up so that can or cannot happen?
So my understanding with the new law is that in order to have a quorum, they all must be in person. So quorum count is in person. And then if you allow for video conferencing through a video conferencing that has been approved in the appropriate manner, and I'll come back to that in just a sec, then you can have people participate, but only if the quorum is in person. So this is more complicated than just that answer, but that's the shortest answer I can give to the question. But I mentioned that the video conferencing policy, it's not like the approval of a normal everyday policy. That requires by the state regulation under public officers law that a public hearing be held to discuss why the board would like to introduce video conferencing as an option for singular members of the board to participate. So it's something to just be aware of. Not only do you need a public hearing, but I would strongly recommend that you just use the template for that policy from the Committee on Open Government. And you can find that on the Committee on Open Government's website. It's something we can match up with the recording of this on our website to make sure you have quick access to it. There's a lot of nuances to this. And once someone you do allow video conferencing for an individual, it triggers a number of other responsibilities in terms of transcription, archiving, and really displaying on the website. It creates extra work for folks. So the board should have a very serious conversation about, do we want to allow this? And do we truly understand what it means to allow this? Do we have the capacity to allow this? Because I think once you allow it, it creates, again, more work for folks. And certainly the case can be made that there may be more transparency and more accountability for that, but we need to do it right. So take it very seriously if you decide to pursue that.
Good one. Next question we have, can a board have a board meeting without the library director?
Sure. They shouldn't. And this comes up every time. Yes, but the only meeting you should have with the director's not in the room is when you're deciding how much to pay them next year. Or if you're bringing some kind of legal charges against them. Why hire a director in the first place if you're not going to use their expertise? I don't think it needs much more than that. Rebecca, you got...
I 100% agree. Like, technically you could, but why you would do that is beyond me, except for the reasons that Jerry gave, because you're going to have to either redo work, you're going to spend a lot of time on stuff the director could have clarified for you right in the moment. Their job is to carry out your will. And if they don't understand where you're coming from on an issue, they don't understand how you arrived at a decision, that's to the disservice of the institution. So I really stick to that description of the board and director as co-leaders of the organization. And that means everyone's at the table for those discussions so we can operate well together as a team. And I have to say, I'm just going to keep going on this. I do advise up and coming directors, don't schedule your vacation. You know the meeting board dates. Don't take the vacation during one of those. And if you are sick, ask them to reschedule it. That would be best practice. You're going to save everyone a lot of headaches, including yourself as a director.
As a trustee, if your board president or your board wants to schedule a meeting without the director, the question is, you should be asking a question, why would we want to do this? And if it's that we don't trust the director, then that's a whole nother ballgame, folks.
You got other problems.
Right. And if you're the director, and this happens to you, it's time to tighten up that resume, guys. It's just the wrong thing.
Yeah, and I looked at it from that perspective that I think Rebecca touched upon, is maybe this is a trustee that's asking that question. Maybe there is some concern that a director isn't showing up for meetings or feels that maybe it's not important for them to be at those meetings. And as somebody that's always been a director in the library world, like, you have to be at those meetings. You have to figure out a way to make sure you're there. I think I've been a director for almost 20 years. I think I've missed maybe one or two board meetings due to circumstances that were out of my control. And but that's my place to to make sure that the board's connected with the organization and the staff and the people that we're charged to serve. You're really, as much as it is the board's meeting, it is of the meeting that you are absolutely an instrumental part to be part of. And then the same thing that, both of you have said is like, you want your director there. No director should be, we had instances of this, or I've learned of instances of this where directors were asked to leave board meetings after delivering their director report. Obviously, open meetings law, that's not a thing. You can't just ask your director to leave, but you want, as a board member, you want your director there, and as a director, you want to absolutely be there. Let's see. Is that me? My next question, Ron? I forget.
Yep.
All right. Our director is not paid for board meeting attendance. This upsets our board. What can we do about it?
Yeah.
I feel like we could all say this one in unison. Pay
Pay
them.
them.
Pay them. Gosh,
And
Ryan, could you when I first saw this, I said it's a salaried exempt position. It's part of the job. They shouldn't get overtime. And then you enlightened me. Could you chime in what you were?
Yeah, I mean, there's two laws that kind of protect directors in this type of situation. They either go through the Fair Labor Standards Act or the Department of Labor for New York State. If you're not paying your employee, even your chief executive officer, the exempt threshold salary, which I believe for January 1st, 2025, is about $60,000 a year, and you have to pay an hourly wage to that director, even though they're the chief executive officer, because if you're not, the organization could be found at fault for either taking advantage of that director for not paying them time and a half when they work over 40 hours per week, or you could be paying them minimum wage or less than minimum wage if they're working more hours than the number of hours that you schedule them to work. So, it goes back to what we all just said in unison. You have to, if they're not meeting that threshold for a salary and they're being paid an hourly rate, pay the director for that time. And then, obviously what Jerry said, if they're exempt, then that should be part of the hours that they work, whether it be 35 or 40 hours that week.
I think this touches on another really challenging issue in some areas of the state where we've got part-time directors. And I have come to the realization after, I guess, 26 years here at Mid-Hudson, there's really no such thing as a part-time director. You may want to pay them as a part-time director, but they are doing the work of a full-time director. And so building the capacity of the budget to recognize that, compensate that person fairly, first of all, and then also be preparing for succession so you can actually recruit folks when that person leaves that will be able to do that job at the level you need them to do it, does require boards to transition to paying full-time directors. Now, whether or not you're hitting the thresholds for the Fair Labor Standards Act to move them into a salaried position is a secondary conversation, but let's combat the fallacy that you can be a part-time director. It really doesn't work that way. And something that is very dangerous for boards is that folks are not allowed, they're literally not allowed to volunteer to do the job they're also paid for. And so you may think you've got a wonderful director who just, puts in extra hours, and aren't they wonderful? But if they ever decide they're not so happy with that situation and they go to the Department of Labor, and the Department of Labor will come back and find in favor of the employee, in this case, the director, and you will owe them back pay, possibly for years, something that you likely cannot afford. So do it right from the outset and protect the organization and treat that person with the dignity and respect they deserve.
Well said.
Yeah.
Okie doke. Next one, please discuss the limitations of employing executive session designation in the various parts of hiring a new executive director, i.e. creating the committee meetings of the committee and interviewing candidates. So how do we use executive session when we're looking at hiring a director?
I think we have to go back to the intent of the law. Executive session is something that's defined in open meetings law. And as many of us are familiar with open meetings law, and if I'm not mistaken, I think it actually used to be called the Sunshine Law, to shine a light on allowing folks to watch their library board do the business of their library. An executive session, the intent of it is to protect the confidentiality of a legal or real estate transaction or the reputation of an individual. So as we we start to think through this, we have to parse out what's public information and what's protected information around a person's reputation. So the formation of a committee, there's no reason for that to be confidential. Everyone needs to know you're conducting a search. I think it should be public information what the criteria is you're using to evaluate candidates. Who the candidates are is where you start to feel a little uncertain, right? Because you might have folks that don't want their current employer to know they're applying for a particular position. And that's, I think, where people get confused of when to use executive session or not. So this is where the committee structure comes into play. So when you think about having a search committee, if you're in a public library, anytime you have 2 or more trustees on a committee, it triggers open meetings law. In an association library, your committees are not triggered for open meetings law unless you're serving a city over 1 million people. So now we've got this divergence in the choose your own adventure path of hiring a new director and which parts of it are confidential and which are not. So association libraries have that benefit of their committee meetings just now operating, perhaps not at the same level as the public libraries are in this particular scenario. So I think it's once we get into the interviews, the discussion of the candidates that are becoming the finalists for the positions, this is where we're edging into discussing the reputation of people that needs to be kept more confidential. So that's the way I think about it, is using this kind of sliding scale of what level of exposure in terms of discussing that person's reputation are you impinging upon. Jerry probably has a better answer than me on this one.
No, you're quoting chapter and verse there. It's perfect.
I think Rebecca touched upon some of this, but we'll go ahead and ask it anyways, just to see if there's different perspectives on it. But I think this comes from the handbook, but why was it that board meetings shouldn't use executive session too frequently? Jerry, I know you talked about this quite often in previous THBC sessions. What are your thoughts? Too frequently. Like
Nobody wants this one.
Oh, sorry, I thought you prompted Jerry, but yeah, I know I've gone on and on about this, but
maybe you were. I don't.
I think it's abused by a lot of folks. And my observation has been that when a board overuses it, it breeds distrust amongst the staff and the public who are wondering what is going on in there. So first, there's the inappropriate use of it, where you go into executive session, you don't say why, and you're probably using it inappropriately in many cases. And that, again, breeds distrust and suspicion of what's going on in there. Why can't they discuss this in the full view of the public? We've also got folks that say, oh, we're going into executive session. You can just go home. Yeah, at the end of the meeting, right? We're not going to do anything big after this. That also kind of says, what are they up to? So it's the perception issue of what is going on. So there's first, are you using it properly? And if you're not, that also makes you look dysfunctional and not like you know what you're doing. And when you use it for issues, it starts to raise a red flag for folks about what's going on. So I just really caution folks, just be judicious. Only use it when you really, really need it, and really understand why you need it.
Right. And there's very few times you really need it. I agree. And all too often, and we've all met with boards that say, but this is a controversial topic. We don't get it. We don't agree with this. We don't want to argue in public. Well, guess what? That's democracy. We argue in public. So not much more to say on that, but if you want to share the grandchildren's pictures, go out in the parking lot. That's what they use it for as well.
I don't even know if this is a great recommendation or not, but I'm just going to throw it out there anyways. But sometimes it's good to benchmark, and that doesn't necessarily benchmark with other libraries, but watch a city council session, watch a school district board session. What are the things that they're holding themselves accountable for talking about as it applies to open meetings law? For some municipal public libraries, that's pretty easy because hopefully you're already in those city council or town council meetings. But as long as, from what you observe and the way things play out, and as long as there's not like a gross misuse of executive session, then that's probably how you need to conduct your sessions as well. If they are talking about the things that maybe you think you shouldn't be talking about in an open meeting, but rather in an executive session, maybe those are the things you do need to be talking about in an open session.
The other thing I'll point out is sometimes it ebbs and flows. If you're in the middle of a real estate transaction, you may be using executive session more frequently than not. But if it's like business as usual and you're just edging into some financial conversations or a personnel discussion, that, you need to be very careful of when do you flip the switch to go into executive session, and is it truly necessary?
And our next question gets at executive session as well. Can you talk about voting during an executive session, or are you coming out of executive session to vote on whatever it is that was discussed during that, if it requires a vote?
Well, remember, if you can vote during executive session, but remember those minutes become public very quickly. They've got to be posted. If you're gonna do a vote, take an action in executive session, it becomes a public document. What is it, 2 weeks now, Rebecca?
It's
One
one
week.
week for
1 week,
executive
1 week.
session.
I stand
Yeah.
corrected. Yeah.
So it shaves a
So
week
you
off
might
of
as
your
well do it in
requirement.
public.
Yeah.
Just come out and do it, rather than having to have another. But again, all of this discussion about why you're, disciplining or giving a raise or awarding a contract can be held in executive session. But once the decision is made, it's a public decision, one way or another.
And there's some votes that can't happen in executive session. So that's why I would like to tell libraries just it's easier just to come out of it and then
Right.
make because it's going to be public anyway. So
All right, let's jump into the next question, and we're moving away from executive sessions now, in a totally different realm. So a lot of the next few questions are going to focus on trustee training. Is workplace violence training required for trustees?
Workplace violence is training is not required for trustees. No, the requirements encompass sexual harassment training and the 2 hours of training on topics relevant to the work of a governing board of a public library or association library. So no, not mandated.
and when we're talking about the 2 hour requirement for continuing education in general for trustees, who supervises trustees about that? Is it the library director or the board president? And this is
So
one that comes up quite a bit.
each library should adopt a trustee education policy, and there is a model on the Division of Library Development's website to use. And in that, you may see that the president is the ultimate holder of the information, but they will likely delegate it to perhaps the secretary or the director to gather it and archive it and keep track of it and let them know how it's going. But ultimately, the board president is responsible for making sure it happens.
Sometimes we get these questions like, is it the board president's job or the director's job? I always just wonder if there's friction between the board president and the director is like, no, that's their job. No, that's their job. But like if that's the situation, go to the diagram of working together and the trustee handbook. Like, while it's not going to answer this very, very specific question, it emphasizes the spirit of that director and board president relationship. You just got to work together on certain things, and it is an undertaking. It's not nothing. Like, you got to make sure all the trustees are doing it. You got to make sure that they're aware of where they can get the training and where it takes place and how to access it. And then also, not everybody provides certificates for that training in the same manner. So like, there's some work there, but like, split up the responsibilities and make sure that it's getting done, because at the end of the day, it's the board president and the director that have to answer to either their, library system or the state education department or even their community members as to why maybe they didn't meet that requirement at the end of it. So make sure it gets done. Can the board establish non-completion of trustee training as a criterion for removal of the board?
I've gotten this question a lot since the new law went into place. And what I always say is that it's a component of a case for removal. I wouldn't say it's a standalone reason unless the person is outwardly and publicly obstinate about it. The person's like, nope, not doing it. Like, we're seeing someone who is basically
Right.
saying, I'm publicly going to break the law, right? This isn't a suggestion. This isn't a regulation. It is state law that you have 2 hours of education every year as a library trustee in the state. So that would probably indicate there's other behavior that is looking similar on different topics. But I would say automatic removal probably would be unreasonable. You'd want to have a redress path for someone who forgot or only got 90 minutes, or something happened in their life and like they just couldn't get it done this year. I think you'd want to create a little grace period or a path to compliance within the next 24, maybe 12 months to get there. But I think when you've got someone who doesn't do it year after year, it's going to add up to making the case potentially for removal because of neglect of duty.
And in the
Rebecca, your answer segues perfectly into all of that. That's 6 pages of legal opinions like I gave you about that. It has to be on purpose. They have to. It can't be inadvertent. There's a lot of flexibility, at least from the commissioner's point of view. But if somebody's going to do it on purpose to make a point, well, then maybe you've got something. Other than that, not enough.
And in the
One of my,
sample, oh, in the sample policy that Rebecca mentioned earlier, it talks about a suspension in there to allow the trustee more time to be able to take it. Because like Rebecca said, life happens and you don't want to have a clause that automatically removes a trustee if maybe you're gunning for this trustee, but at the same time you have somebody who just wasn't able to complete it, but they're fantastic. So it's hard to have that hard stop that just eliminates trustees from your board because you don't want to have a situation where you're below quorum for trustees because you didn't have people do the trustee education either.
and not that anyone asked, but I'm going to share another tip. I had a wonderful board member a few years ago, Deborah Wilcox Klein, who just passed away very recently. We miss her very much, but her legacy lives on in many ways in our system. And one of the things she helped us institute was an annual board activities list that just sits on our board's webpage. So they kind of know what to anticipate across the 12 months of the year. So they know that in January, we always do the oath of office, sign the ethics statement, sign the conflict of interest disclosure form. Oh, look at that. In July, we always get the audit report. Oh, look at that. In November, we always approve the budget. Oh, look at that. November 30th, our 2 hours of training is always due. And they know that we review it in January, so you can't say you didn't know. And then when we get there we do reminders. There's really no excuse at that point. We're constantly reminding people of where the options are to get training that would help them come into compliance. So I think we also need to help set people up for success, right? We can't, assume they know or never mention it since it got passed 2 years ago. You can't have new people come on who are never made aware of it and then try to catch them about it 12 months later.
All right. Is the library required to offer medical benefits to full-time employees?
If they want full-time employees,
I think that this goes back together this goes back to when we were saying in unison, pay them. I feel like this is part of that compensation package too. Like Jerry said, like when you think about recruiting individuals for full-time positions, because libraries, it's a professional position in a lot of places, whether you need a degree or not, there's a high level of things that people are going to have to do, whether they're directing the organization, whether they're performing programming, whether they're doing any of the other full-time items. It's just something where having a comparable benefits package to other full-time employment is just something that you do. Yeah.
I think to retain and recruit staff is a really good answer there. But I would also just speak to the being humane.
Mm.
Like, how dare you honestly not provide medical insurance for a full-time employee? Offering a buyout if they're able to get it through a partner or spouse is certainly, I think, a good idea as well. But to consider asking an adult to work without health insurance, without that safety net, that could literally bankrupt their family or make it impossible for them to work for you is not good stewardship of the organization.
I thought I was the cranky one here.
Oh, I'm very, this is my thing, and I've been bothering
Rebecca, they're probably not paying them enough they're probably paying them so poorly anyway, they can still get Medicaid.
Is that who we
Yeah.
want to be, though? When we think
No,
about
no,
our
no, I'm kidding.
institutions and living
I
our
know.
values
All
out
right.
loud,
All
I think
right.
we've got to step up when it comes to library workers. And yeah, I've been bothering Brian and Ron about this all year because it's something I really want to focus on here in my own system is really let's treat our workers with dignity so they stick around. And our largest asset we have in library land, our wonderful staff that care and are trained and are helping people every day. When people say like they love your library, a lot of times they mean they love your staff. And so if you're not treating them with the care and respect that the public would expect, I think there will be backlash one way or the other. You'll turn folks against the library. You won't be able to retain staff. You won't be able to attract new staff because they have more options than ever with the skill sets necessary to work in a library. So I think that's what we got to get more serious about faster.
Yeah, we just recently had a workshop about this a week ago when we talked about manageable ways that library boards can incorporate different types of benefits for library staff or library workers at their library. I think it is important that they bring up the legality question, like what is legally required, because I do see libraries sometimes miss this. So like when it comes to certain types of benefits that a library absolutely has to provide, paid sick leave is one, jury duty payment, and then also time off to vote. And now these all come with stipulations and schedules. It's based on the size of your organization or the number of people that you employ. But those are three laws that I sometimes see libraries overlook, or things that boards are not aware of, where New York State has actual legal requirements for organizations to provide these types of benefits to their employees. And a lot of libraries don't do that, and so they're not in compliance with the law. But yes, going back to what everybody else has already said here, like it's an issue of core values. Like, you know, like we talk, there's multiple. If you read through the core values, there's multiple parts where we talk about the life and the benefit of the library work in a library. And you know, we're service-based organizations. Yes, we have tangible things like books and technology and programs that are experiential and outreach work that we do, but it's people that drive all that. It's people that drive all that. And yeah, I think anybody here could go on and on and on about that concern and issue.
And I think to the next question is going to come, well, how are we going to pay for that? We just don't have the money for it. You know, creating financial goals for the organization is a good practice, to say, okay, if we were going to do this the right way, what would it cost? Let's get some real information, put it into a multi-year financial plan, and start making the case to our voters and explaining why we need to get here. And hopefully the community comes through in that partnership, to get the board to where they need to be to adequately fund the library, which is one of the primary responsibilities of a board.
You know, Rebecca, I can't resist taking the opportunity to throw in, you know, we have all spent a lot of time on trying to help libraries plan for the next 50 to 100 years, to really plan for the future, including creating that toolkit for changing legal structure. If you really can't afford to run a library, then you need to think about how you're going to get to the future. What do your job is to plan ahead. And if you can't make ends meet today, what about tomorrow? Do you value your institution, or are you just trying to do it as cheaply as you can? And if your institution cannot survive in the structure that it has right now, then find another way, and there are other ways, to continue the tradition and continue that institution that may have 100 years behind it. And it's your job to make sure it has another 100 years. And there's ways to do that, but maybe old ways won't work. Maybe new ways will. And there are great opportunities to do this.
I think it's an appropriate time just to plug our budgets and finance workshop that we did a couple of years ago on the Trustee Handbook Book Club website. So please check it out. We talked about, you know, service-based budgeting, as well as funding referendums, and how to really shore up the funds that you need to provide all the services that your community and library deserves. I know we're like running close to time, but like, can we do like one or two more questions? Because this is fun, and I don't want to get off. I got other stuff to do. So, so next question is it permissible to have co-presidents to share the duties? It's a different question.
I've gotten this question a number of times over the years. I wonder if you folks have as well. The answer is no. We need to have one person in charge. The other person can be the vice president and step in as needed, as that position is designed to do. But we need to have one person in charge that has the information they need to be successful, and it has the responsibility to make that position what it truly needs to be to lead the board. So I'd be interested to hear if any of you have had an experience of co-presidents that's worked, but I have never seen it work.
I've had experiences where it has not worked multiple times, where I hear about it much later, where a library will get in touch and say, Ron, this isn't working out. We got co-presidents. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, you know, here's why. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Rebecca. It's not a structure that works well, and it's not a permissible thing to do. So president, vice president, and then have your secretary and your treasurer or finance officer. Those are the officers you're going to look for. That was easy. Um, how about, do we need a policy that sets out the responsibilities of each person in the finance team? That would be the treasurer, bookkeeper, director, maybe a finance officer as a trustee, depending on the type of library.
Yeah,
Well, I think
yeah, sorry,
go
Joey.
ahead.
No, please. This is your
As
fun.
Ron-
You dug into it so hard in the last issue, that last edition.
Yeah, look in the appendix to the trustee handbook. And if that's not good enough, there's a very short webinar under the HATS, helping all trustees succeed under the treasurer. So you don't need a policy, but there's duties for each. Enough said.
In a way, it's not the policy, it's almost like a little job description for each. So we're really clear on the division of duties. Yeah.
All right, next question. Do you recommend term limits for officers of the board?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And here's why. Because you need to plan for succession. And if you've got someone that just sits in that role for 10, 20 years, some things can happen. And you could have a fabulous person in that role. I was just talking to a library last night where they keep making what they were calling dispensations to keep their board president because they were so wonderful. And the board president pulled me aside afterwards, like, I'm so tired. Like I want to get out of this seat, but no one's coming up after me. And every time I say, can
Right.
someone else please do this? They won't do it because they like me so much, but I don't want to do it anymore. And like literally that's what the voice was doing, was like cranking up. So there can be all sorts of reasons the person would like to move on. It's healthy to have turnover in those positions. It builds the capacity of your board over time. It helps with recruitment. It allows for a beginning and an end, so planning can happen on a faster cycle. And of course, there's certainly trustees I have worked with who have done a stellar job for a very, very long time, and I'm not slagging them at all. But I do think it's a healthier pattern to have regular turnover in those positions to get more folks experienced with that and to make sure the oversight is being done properly.
Yeah. Agreed.
And I would just say from like the director's perspective, like sometimes it's challenging for us. Like in our organization, it's 3 years for a president. So you work with the same president for 3 years, and then that president has to step down, and there's a new president. And every president is a different experience for a director. But that's one of those awesome challenges that we get to like embrace as a director. Is like, okay, so how do like one, I develop this relationship with this board president, so we're getting the most out of our board and doing really good things. But two, like, what are some changes or what are some things that I need to adjust in the work that I do and how I approach my work, so that we are getting the most out of this individual? Because I have seen times where a director is like, oh, that board president, we had a fantastic relationship. This new board president comes along and it's just different, or the board president just doesn't have it as much in their heart as the previous board president. Well, guess what? That's when it's your time as a director to really step up and sharpen those skills that you have to try to get the best out of that board president that you can possibly get out of them. Every board president is going to be a different experience, but you as a director want that. Like, you don't want to see the same board president sticking around forever, because they will fade. And sometimes, you're only as good as the people you surround yourself with. And sometimes if your board president's starting to fade, you might start fading too, although we would hope that's not the case.
So we're in a board meeting, and the first thing that always comes up is the agenda. And the question that is coming up next is there a requirement to approve that agenda at a board meeting?
Not particularly, but it's just a process to make sure everybody agrees on what they're going to talk about.
I think it's important, and I'm certainly not a Robert's Rules expert, so you can go watch the Parliamentary Procedures edition of the Trustee Handbook Book Club. But I think it's important that everyone agrees, yes, this is what we're going to talk about during this meeting. And, I need an adjustment made here because I have to leave early, or whatever it might be, just to make sure we're all in agreement about what we're doing here this evening and what the goal is to get through by the end of the meeting.
It also agrees that we're not going to talk about certain other things. So that's probably more important than anything else. That here's your chance if you have another issue you want to bring up, or forever hold your peace. And that's really why it's there.
All right. Next question. After meeting minutes are approved, should draft minutes be removed? So I'm assuming this means the meeting took place based on open meetings law. They got the draft minutes up on the website. And now the next meeting's happened. Those minutes were approved. Do the draft minutes come off the website? And then the new minutes go up, correct? The approved minutes.
Sure.
Yeah.
I agree. Yep.
Okay.
Easy one.
Next one's easy too.
Yeah, it is. I think we've all talked about this at length. Sexual harassment training, is it required for trustees? In unison, yes.
Yes.
Take it.
I will
Got
note, being on a couple of other nonprofit boards, if you do it for one board, it works for, in other words, it has legs. You can travel with it at least throughout the year until you got to do it again.
And I'll say, I did go head to head with a town attorney on this, who claimed it did not apply to boards of trustees. And I feel I thoroughly won that argument, because the truth is, as a trustee, you're in a position of authority. And so that creates a power dynamic with staff where you could very well be the aggressor in that situation, or have someone on your board that is the aggressor. Right. And so I would think a legal test of that would clearly say, trustees in a way are the employees employer in that situation. And really, because of that power dynamic, it's even more important that you're taking the sexual harassment prevention training to avoid any impropriety or sense of impropriety. We've got folks of many different generations on our boards, folks that came up during a different time, and understanding what's considered sexual harassment is very, very important. Things we might think are casual, or I know I accept from an older trustee than I would never accept from a younger trustee. We need to really equalize that standard and make sure we're all held to the same standard moving forward.
Yeah. And I do want to repeat, this isn't just for libraries. This is, I mean, basically any organization within the state of New York, and one of the organizations I'm involved with does have audits. Not like we have audits from the controller; they have audits from recording Medicaid issues and Office of the People with Developmental Disabilities and whatnot, and they check that.
Mhm.
They want to look at the trustees and want to see if they had their trainings.
And even
And
with
so,
the
yeah,
even with the Office of State Comptroller, if you look at the audits from the end of last year into this year, there's an awful lot of sexual
oh,
harassment prevention
okay,
training audits that have been done
good.
on government entities for trustees, boards.
Mm.
And just a reminder, it's supposed to be done by October 1st.
All right, we're getting near the end. Ron, how about we take the last two questions? I think that'll set us up well on time, and also I think allow us to end on a really positive note. I like the next two questions too because they apply to both organizational culture as well as board culture. So the second to last question is, how do you encourage or empower trustees to take ownership of their library?
It's a broad question, right?
Yes,
Like the
theoretical.
idea of ownership of it. And sometimes I think it goes back to something we said earlier, which is, do you understand your job as a library trustee? Do you understand the responsibility you've said yes to by joining a library board? And so that training and onboarding and describing the role, I think it starts right there at the beginning. It might even start before the person comes on the board with explaining the opportunity to volunteer to serve on the board. So folks are really clear on what the work is when they come in. Sometimes you inherit or you're on a board where there's been folks that have been there a super long time. They never got that onboarding. There might be some unhealthy practices or kind of lack of ownership, which is being described in this question. And there are certain facilitated conversations about where are we going? Why are we here? What's our mission and vision that probably should be facilitated at a reorganizational meeting to help people come to consensus about why we're here and what our goals are. And so I think refreshing that conversation on a regular basis helps to build more buy-in for why we're here, what we're doing, taking responsibility and ownership over some of the tasks that are coming up this year. So sometimes it has to be facilitated, but can also be manifested by the way we onboard folks.
All three of you have been subjected to my early classes about it's all about the mission and why we're here, and I really have had some of my best workshops with boards when we did an annual retreat, or at least every couple of years, where we got the library board. And you've seen me when I've done these workshops. Why are you here? Why are you a trustee? And half the time they say, oh, because Sue told me it'd be an easy job. I only have to come for an hour every month. And the point of that conversation, which I'm just reflecting what Rebecca said, is they begin to understand how important it is that they have been entrusted, that's their word, that's a name, with this institution that has decades, if not centuries, behind it in serving the community. And they have to take it seriously. And that's really the very first thing. It's not about lending books. It's about creating civilization. It's about including people in a democracy. We can get poetic here, but you need to take time to do that every once in a while. Otherwise, the board doesn't know why they're there. It's a bigger picture than did we pay the bills this month? Anyway, I think we've made our points, but that's the only way I know how to get them really engaged, is let them know how important the damn job is.
So let's say we get them engaged, and then this next question is coming from the perspective of a library director. So how to work together and keep everyone on track. So not all presidents have the skills to lead. So how do you get the group to keep everyone accountable, responsible, and moving forward in a healthy and supportive way?
So, I mean, I have a colleague, Jen Ballerman, down at the Patchogue Medford Library, and she always says gifts differing. Different trustees bring different gifts to the table, and how you maximize those is part of the director's job. How you understand the skill sets that folks bring to that table is important. But the board president in particular, I think, has distinct responsibilities on this topic to keep folks organized and on task. And if that president isn't capable of that, doesn't want to do that kind of job, we need to have them step aside so someone else can. So that sounds a little harsh, I know, but that board president really sets the tone for things moving forward, and doing so in conjunction and in partnership with the director to keep folks organized, to keep us on task. Let's keep things moving. Let's address when it's not going well and try to course correct in a group conversation. It takes work. It takes a lot of work. And so I think that part of that is making sure the director has the administrative capacity to support the board in the way they most need. And sometimes that means rethinking the role of the director. One of my kind of warning signs when I go to work with a library board is when they call the director the librarian. That says to me they don't see the director as an administrator, as their co-leader. They think of them as the person who sits at the front desk, and not the person that is in charge of this very important institution that is there to help them stay on track and move the organization forward. So I think there's that. In the ideal situation, the director is going to help compensate sometimes when you've got a board president that doesn't have the complete skill set, or can nudge them to help them get the complete skill set. But, calling upon other trustees like the vice president to come in and help out with some things, sometimes getting that team together on things can be helpful in certain situations, given the particulars of the humans that you're working with in that moment. But I also think we need to address the fact that sometimes we aren't designing our staff capacity in a way that allows the director to play the role the board truly needs them to play.
I think you've said it all. Thanks for that shout out to Jen. She's one of the nicest people and best librarians there is, period.
100%.
All right. I think that brings us to the end of our session, the December 2024 after party for Trustee Handbook Book Club. Rebecca Smith-Aldrich, Jerry Nichols, Ron Kurtzop. It is absolutely a pleasure to work with you. This is the ending of our 4th year working together. We're going into our 5th year doing this Trustee Handbook Book Club thing. It's an absolute joy. I mean, it is an absolute joy. We love sitting in on these sessions together and learning from each other and engaging with all of you. And we learn from you as well, just by you asking the questions. A lot of these questions, as much as we've been doing this for a while and we've got some experience, we also have to do some research on our end. So it certainly encourages us to have that growth mindset and make sure that we're staying sharp in the skills and the work that we're doing too. So we just want to thank everybody for being here. As you heard, Ron mentioned that our next Trustee Handbook Book Club is going to take place on Wednesday, January 22nd. It's going to happen from 5 to 6:30 p.m. We're going to be talking about advocacy, which we're super excited about because that's going to tee us up for Advocacy Day, which happens on February 5th in partnership with the New York Library Association. Hopefully we can get many of not only library staff there, but library trustees as well. You serve as tremendous advocates for the work that we do here in the library world. The other thing I just want to share out with you is we made multiple references today to the Trustee Handbook Book Club resources. So please visit the website midhudson.org/trustee book club. That's where you can find all of our previously recorded Trustee Handbook Book Club sessions, whether it's the after parties or the sessions that Jerry and Rebecca led us through, as well as some of our guest presenters as well. So like I said, after 4 years of doing this, we love doing it. We find a lot of joy in it. We hope that you find joy in it as well. And we just wanted to thank you so much for supporting us through this work. We couldn't be here if it wasn't for all of you. And lastly, we just want to thank you for doing the work. We have been blessed to be able to, get paid to do this. And it's a wonderful thing, but all of you just show up and are there for your community, for your library, and supporting your staff, your volunteers, and your friends and your advocates, just by being thoroughly engaged. And so thank you, everybody. We appreciate it. We hope you have a wonderful finish to 2024, and we absolutely look forward to seeing you again in 2025. Be well and take care of yourselves.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys.